Drones are a really interesting case of a novel technology in DC. There hasn't been a lot like it. And it's interesting too because it's unclear how to regulate them. You know, the FAA sounds like it wants to do it, but they're mostly concerned with safety. But you know, drones are cool. They're very cool. In fact, for example, they have a ton of potential. 100% of all the processing in land is done by unmanned aircraft. And the reason why is extremely dangerous. You're flying very low, and you often have to pull up right at the end of the row of whether you're growing, because there are wind breaks like trees and stuff, and if you don't pull up fast enough, if you even hesitate, you run into a bunch of trees, you're probably going to crash and die, which is horrible. But for a whole bunch of sort of things that cost a lot of money, you know, inspecting power lines over mountain ranges, you have mountaineers or helicopters who get up there. Architects will, after they've just built a building, will take a drone with a laser and go around and make a really accurate 3D model and see, you know, what's happening, if anything's missing. And journalists and filmmakers, you know, it costs about $10,000 an hour to operate a helicopter to do really cool shots for film. And you can buy a drone that can do that stuff for like $300. It's like a quadricopter. And I can talk about this later, but you know, military use of drones and civilian use of drones, they're not exactly separable. I mean, one feeds into the other, and I want to just acknowledge that I'm aware of that. I can talk about that later, but it's not something you work on. But in addition to the promise, there's also some pretty serious potential for abuse with drones. They're very small, you know, they're this big. I've seen one that was literally like that big. I can show you a video of this. They're extremely cheap, so you know, $300 with a commercial quadricopter to pair it. And they're a lot of fun. They have no human on board, and of course they have no human. They're called unmanned aerial vehicles, but that means they can go places that manned aircraft cannot go. So, for example, between narrow buildings, you know, in environments that may be too hot or too whatever for humans to be. And they can do things that manned planes can't. So they can accept a whole lot of G-forces. And they can do crazy things like I've seen. Oh man, there's some great stuff we've seen in the that blow your mind. I can point you to. And they can also, you know, spend a whole lot of time aloft. You have a ground-based pilot. Maybe you have 3, given like all the 8-hour shifts, and it's the same drone is done for a week or something like that. You can't do that with a plane. You can, but it's a lot more difficult. And all the sort of variety of what we consider non-intuitive high-tech surveillance packages that are on manned aircraft are going to be available on drones soon. So, for example, gigapixel imaging giving like centimeter, sub-centimeter resolution of like the entire city of Manhattan, you know, a number of times in an hour, something like that. And that sort of people don't think about that. You can be very precisely tracked using these kinds of technologies. LiDAR, which is laser kinds of ranging that can see through some types of diffuse foliage. Synthetic aperture radar SAR, they look through things like drapes, and you know, people don't think the drapes are something that might protect you, but it may not in the future with these kinds of packages on the drone platforms. So what's going on in DC? The FAA, there's a law that requires them to integrate drones into the national airspace by 2015. They're going to do this by setting up 6 test sites across the states where you can operate your drone and they can study them and figure out what do we need to do to set up rules about how this work. But you know, our position is that both privacy and safety demand that we have some basic requirements on information that you can get about drones. And you know, how does this work for other vehicles? This is how we started to think. There are clear privacy and safety interests. You know, if you're an aircraft and you need to know what else is around you, that's a clear information need. How do ground-based people, you know, if you're in your backyard and you don't know if there are things about you, or if you see 4 things that appear to be spying on you, how do you know about what's going on there? Like, maybe they're just delivering tacos or something, like the taco cover. It doesn't actually exist. That would be fun, right? But we imagined an analogy. You know, there's license plates, you know, on vehicles or the engine number on aircraft. Those are used not just by law enforcement to give you tickets, but it's also useful, you know, you leave your headlights on, someone can say, hey, someone's license plate this, headlights are on, or insurance purposes. You know, there's a lot of non-government uses of license plates that we do. was thinking about this, and again, wrote a blog post, amazing what blog posts can do, and I thought, we need something like an N number for drones. Unfortunately, you're going to need like a ground-based telescope to read these damn things because they're so tiny, it just doesn't make sense. What about radio frequency? So, what about broadcasting an identifier that people could actually see if they had the right equipment? How does that make sense? A radio frequency license plate? That sounds like a good idea. When I wrote this blog post, I got a bunch of feedback from people in hobbyists and commercial aviation who pointed out that this exists, so it's not an original idea, that's fine. Something called EDSB out, automatic dependent surveillance mode B out, is an actual radio frequency standard required by the Federal Aviation Administration for all aircraft by 2020. It broadcasts an identifier, your position, your speed, altitude, once every 2 seconds. And this is used on manned aircraft to replace the radar-based air traffic control. And if you think about this, the way radar works is it makes a sweep like that. And the way that you tell where an aircraft is you hear an echo back, and you have to extrapolate between 2 echoes to figure out what direction it's going and where it is. And that gives you an error bound around that's pretty big. If instead you use this ADSB, what you do is you have GLONASS, which is the Russian version of GPS or GPS, based on the actual aircraft. So it's broadcasting its position, its velocity, and its identifier. And then that error circle around where the plane is gets a lot smaller. And then you can do really neat things like pack more airlines in line and land and make sure that we can have more people being able to fly. Our airspace is increasingly crowded. But it also means that ground-based receivers can receive this stuff and do things with it. So we wrote to the Federal Aviation Administration and said, you need to establish a registry for drones. And we talked about UAS as the fancy multi-syllable word for drone. We've talked about why I use the word drone because it's one syllable. Some consider it a euphemism for UAS or whatever. We said you need to have a registry that has the ownership information for this stuff, that has some information about what kind of drone it is. Is it a quadricopter? Is it a heptacopter with 7 blades? I mean, whatever. It needs to have a data collection statement that shows what it's doing, the sensing packages that it has on it, how it's going to retain the stuff, how it's going to share the stuff, and a point of contact that you get to add and write somewhere or sue them. You need to have a way of doing that. And they should issue what's called a mode-S text code, which is basically the thing you broadcast from the aircraft to tell people where the ID is. And then a human-friendly U number for UAS that you could actually have on the thing if it crashes and stuff like that. And it's not broadcast. We said that everyone should have to transmit this unless you're doing very low altitude recreational, educational, research kinds of purposes or uses of drones. There should be an exception for these sort of regular, small, not going to get anyone in trouble or have any safety implications kinds of uses. But the vision here is that both other aircraft in the sky and ground observers can see in real time around them what drones are flying around, buzzing around. And the FAA and companies, like, you can imagine a Google Drones, where you can actually aggregate this stuff in one place. And in fact, you can do this right now. If you have an iPad, you can spend $900 and get this neat antenna and actually see what's around you flying around right now. And there's another one made by Garmin. It's a little bit cheaper, but we want to make our idea is that we can have not only positions and like where everyone is on the actual map, but you can click on them and see what they're doing. Since we wrote this, we've got a ton of interest in this, which is interesting because we're not playing real. But we got a lot of interest in this stuff. There's a whole lot of complications right now to do this. You have to have a flight certified GPS system, which is extremely expensive. You have to have a transponder. They look like this, then a human interface. You don't need that for drones. That box is not the size of a deck of cards, so it's not that big. It is non-trivial. Fortunately, they are building these things for drones right now, but it costs about $6,000 just to get the thing, not even to incorporate it onto the drone. And so, if you're buying a $300 drone, you've got to have this package in order to actually do things with it. That's a lot of money. That's a significant barrier. And actually, when we talk to people in sort of the drone industry, be sort of a deal breaker for doing this kind of stuff. They're like, maybe there should be a barrier. Maybe there should be some basic economic barrier to people flying these things in ways that might be safety hazards and price and stuff. Okay, so that was a bit long. We do have something like 20 minutes for stuff. I really appreciate you listening.